I've been putting the chairs away. This time is going to be a lot more cheerful than you remember March 13th of 2020 when they shut us down. We had to sanitize the chairs with wipes and stack them up and Well, something a little different. Got a family story for you today about our son Ben. Ben grew up with home computers. We got our first Apple II when he was just 3 years old. By the time he was in middle school, he was writing programs on the Macintosh. Remember those kind of bubblegum colored ones with the big bluey anyway? And he decided that sharing the family home computer was kind of a drag, and after all, he didn't want to have one of his own that he might take to college with him. So from middle school on, he began to save his money. He began to work hard. Summers, he did every kind of job a kid could get paid for. He mowed lawns. He threw newspapers. He walked dogs and even washed them. He did whatever he could find. But there came a summer between his junior and senior year of high school when a kid could not get a paying job. See, Bartlesville, Oklahoma was the international headquarters of the Phillips Petroleum Company. And if you know the oil business, you know that it has booms and it has busts, and that particular year was a bust year. There were petroleum engineers mowing lawns. There were geophysicists throwing newspapers, flipping burgers, whatever they could find to do. And Ben tried and tried, but he couldn't find a regular paying job. And when he had run through all the paid extra chores that we and the neighbors could come up with, he complained that it was just frustrating to sit around and not have work to do. And I suggested, well, maybe you could find someplace to volunteer and do something regular. But all we could find there was at Tallgrass Estates, which was a nursing home. He said, Mom, a nursing home? We remembered the small town nursing home where some of Gordon's relatives had spent their last days, and it was dark and smelled funny. And I said, well, at least go check it out. It's across the street from the hospital. It might be better. He came back and he said, you know, it's not really so bad. It's clean, it's bright, and the people aren't real sick. They're just in walkers and wheelchairs. And the folks just want me to stand at the information desk and help people, or maybe mix with the residents. They call them mix with the residents. So he decided to do it. And we began to look forward to his return home after each episode at Tallgrass Estates, because he was meeting the most interesting people. There was the lady who didn't let her walker get in the way of playing killer croquet in the courtyard. She inspired Ben. He took our croquet set and set it up in the backyard, but he had sand traps and obstacles, cutting holes, more like miniature golf. Then there were the good old boys that taught him how to play poker. Well, he had learned basic poker when math class did statistics. These guys played for blood. Ben lost most of 1 week's allowance before he caught on how to really do it. But his favorite was Miss Edna. Miss Edna was in a wheelchair, and he could usually track her down. If not in the common room, she'd be in her little room. And they developed a kind of routine. First, Miss Edna would ask him what he had been doing with his friends. Had they been out to Osage Hill State Park? Had they been swimming? What was he up to? And then it was her turn. And she would tell him stories about growing up on a ranch in Osage County, where, as she said, she was the youngest of 9 brothers. Because they taught her how to rope and ride before she even started school. And then to go to school at the one-room schoolhouse, there was no school bus. They rode there bareback on the family horses. Oh, the mischief they got into, the devilment. She told him about riding calves. I didn't know you could do that. She told about walking across the train trestle and almost getting caught by a train. Every day, he came home with more Miss Edna stories. We really looked forward to it. She told about how it was on the ranch when the 30s hit and the droughts, and how they had to sell their cattle and finally sell the land and move into town. Most of her brothers were gone by then, had moved off in search of work. But in town, at least she was able to go to the high school. She went to the secretarial classes, won a prize for speed typing and accuracy. And then after she graduated, she got work in a doctor's office, a little small-town doctor. And she told about how sometimes people paid him with chickens or fresh eggs or turnips, or one time a box of baby chicks who got loose in the waiting room. She told about the impact of World War II on the town and how so many of the young men left. The last of her brothers took off. Some of them never came back. Others saw the world and stayed away. But she was on her own. She was able, when the country began to boom again, she bought her own house. She bought her own car. She told him about driving to Dallas by herself, driving to Denver, driving even to St. Louis. This was before the interstates. She had a number of adventures. She told about keeping such good records for the doctor that they began to see patterns, and they wrote some papers that they presented. And then packed up the family Macintosh and took it to show her about word processing programs. And she laughed and laughed. No whiteout, no erasing multiple carbons. Oh, how wonderful that would be. But she didn't think much of that little ticky-tacky keyboard. She liked to just bang on the keys of a proper typewriter. She had had offers of marriage, but she was just too independent. But then about 10 years before, when her legs gave out on her and she realized she was going to be in a wheelchair, family all gone, she checked herself into Tallgrass Estates and had not been out for the past 10 years except for doctor appointments. I said, oh, that must have been awful. What'd you do? And Ben said, well, I just grabbed the handle of her wheelchair, pushed her out the door. We went across the street to the hospital. We went up to that new lounge on the top floor with floor-to-ceiling windows. And I showed her what had happened in Bartlesville. She spotted landmarks. She showed me where the old post office used to be and where, they used to have a drive-in movie. She could recognize, and then I told her about how they built the mall and about what all those neon drive-in things were down there. And Mom, it was great. It was kind of like being in a flying time machine to look down on the town and hear about what used to be where. It was really great. Well, school started in the fall and senior year hit. And Ben was busy. He had honors classes, he had papers to write, he had projects to do. And when I asked from time to time, I was missing the Miss Edna stories. I asked from time to time, hey, have you thought about going back to see how your friends at Tallgrass Estates are doing? Well, he was too tired. He was too busy. Finally, it was Christmas break. And I did the mama guilt trip thing. And I said, Ben, you've got no excuse now. Why don't you go back and see how those folks are? And that's when he admitted, Mom, well, you see, I've been too busy to read the newspapers. I haven't kept up on the obituaries. Those were old people, and I'm afraid they've died, and I missed it. And I said, well, but maybe they didn't. Maybe they're still there and they're missing you and wondering what you've been up to. Go ahead. It was Christmas Eve. I've got things taken care of here. You help me with the cookies. You help me with the decorating. Why don't you go spend the afternoon and find out how they are? So he got the car and he went. And the afternoon passed and I fixed dinner. And we had dinner. And he still hadn't come back. And I began to worry, thinking about Christmas parties and drunk drivers. And I began to worry about harassed shoppers running out for last-minute presents. And I began to get really concerned about the time. And finally, he drove in, and he was beaming. And I said, oh, Ben, how was it? Did you get to see him? And he said, yeah, the croquet lady was there and the poker fellas were there. But he said, when I went looking for Miss Edna, she wasn't there. And I went to her room and her wheelchair was there and her bed was there and all her things, but the bed was made up and she wasn't there. So I asked the nurses. And they said, oh, Ben, last week she had a stroke. She fell out of bed, hit her head, and we took her over to the hospital. So Ben just dashed out the door, went across the street, went to the hospital, to the desk, and asked where Miss Edna Cobalt was. And they said, oh, we're so glad a relative has finally come to look in on her. Well, he didn't tell them that he was no relation. He just went straight up to her room. And there she was, in her bed. He said, oh, Mom, she looked so tiny and she had this big bandage on her forehead. But she recognized me and she waved me in and pointed to a chair, and I sat down, and just like usual, I told her all about what I've been doing in high school, senior year, college applications and projects and things we've been doing. And then it was her turn to tell me her stories. And Mom, that's when I found out she could start a sentence, but then she couldn't find the words. And I realized she'd had an aphasic stroke. Well, Ben, what'd you do? He said, oh, I just told her stories back to her. All those stories that I used to bring home to you. I told her about growing up on the ranch in the Osage. I told about high school and the doctor's office and her adventures. And she just smiled. And Mom, it was the best Christmas Eve ever. And why are you crying? Because I broke down. And Ben's a good kid. And he taught me it's important for all of us to tell our stories, but it's also important to listen.